on a cold winter morning, inside a quiet bedroom where even the light seemed reluctant to enter, a man who had spent his entire life racing against time finally lay still. There were no cheering crowds outside his window, no political allies waiting for instructions, no soldiers waiting for one more command, no reporters hoping for one final sentence to print before sunrise. There was only the slow sound of fading breath, the gentle presence of the woman who had shared his life for decades, and the strange silence that often arrives before history quietly turns another page. It was difficult to believe that this peaceful figure had once seemed almost impossible to exhaust. Throughout his life, he had climbed mountains that defeated stronger men, crossed dangerous rivers simply because they were there, hunted across distant continents, challenged the richest industrialists in America, survived illness, grief, danger, political betrayal, and the kind of public hatred that can make weaker souls retreat into comfort. Motion had become his natural language. Struggle had become his form of prayer. Stillness had always felt, to him, like a small kind of death. Yet, in the end, even the fiercest spirit must eventually face the quiet truth that every human body has limits, no matter how determined the mind may be. He had spent decades trying to prove that courage could bend reality, that effort could remake flesh, that a man could wrestle weakness to the ground if only he refused to yield. But on that final morning, his strength no longer answered him. The same body he had commanded like a restless army had finally lowered its flag. Perhaps that is why his story continues to captivate people more than a century later. Behind every great achievement stood a man who knew fear far better than most imagined. Behind every victory was someone trying to outrun weakness before it could catch him again. Before we begin this journey together, take a quiet moment to subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful stories that slow the pace of a busy day. Your support allows this channel to continue bringing remarkable lives back into the light, one unforgettable story at a time. Now, let us leave that silent room behind and travel backward through memory. Long before newspapers celebrated his courage, before presidents sought his advice, before history remembered his name, there was only a fragile little boy entering a rapidly changing city that seemed far larger than he could possibly understand. No one looking at that child would have imagined that he would one day reshape the destiny of an entire nation. In truth, there was every reason to believe that he might never even grow into a healthy man. New York in the middle of the 19th century was not yet the towering city of steel and glass that would later dominate the imagination of the world. It was a place still caught between old streets and new ambitions, between horse-drawn carriages and the first signs of modern power, between inherited wealth and the restless hunger of immigrants arriving with little more than hope in their hands. The city breathed loudly. Wagons groaned over uneven roads. Church bells floated through the morning air. Merchants called from crowded storefronts, and at night, gas lamps cast small circles of golden light into streets that quickly dissolved into darkness. It was a city learning how to become itself. Downtown, narrow roads still remembered an older colonial world. Uptown, order slowly pushed northward, drawing straight lines across farms, estates, and open land. Fine homes stood not far from crowded boarding houses. Polished parlors existed within the same city as alleys, thick with smoke, hunger, and the smell of labor. For a child born into comfort, this world offered beauty, privilege, and protection. But it also offered a lesson that would return again and again throughout his life. Society was never one thing. It was always conflict wearing a familiar face. The family into which he was born belonged to the upper reaches of old New York. Their name carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it had been present for generations. They were not people who had recently climbed into wealth and wished the world to notice. They moved with the quiet confidence of those who believed their place had already been established long before they arrived. Their history reached backward to Dutch settlers, old merchants, family branches, inherited expectations, and a sense that public life was not merely an opportunity, but an obligation. His father was the moral son of the household, tall, vigorous, warm, and commanding without cruelty. He seemed to possess the kind of strength that made others feel steadier simply by standing near him. He had money, but money was never the most interesting thing about him. He believed that privilege without service was a kind of failure. He worked with charities, helped children, supported the poor, visited families in need, and carried his responsibilities with an almost physical energy. To the boy, his father was not simply a parent. He was the visible shape of goodness combined with action. His mother came from another world entirely. She carried the grace and sorrow of the American South, a region wounded by memory, pride, and contradiction. Delicate in health and poetic in temperament, she often seemed to live partly in the present and partly among stories from a vanished childhood. She could charm a room with her voice, drawing her children into tales of family honor, distant plantations, brave relatives, old customs, and a lost world that history had already begun to bury. Where his father taught duty through action, his mother taught imagination through memory. Inside that home, the child absorbed two different inheritances. From his father, he learned that a life should be spent in service, discipline, and effort. From his mother, he learned that stories could preserve entire worlds after they had disappeared. This combination would later define him in ways even he may not have understood. He would become a man of relentless motion, yet also a man obsessed with memory. He would fight in the present, but always with one eye fixed on history, as though every action mattered more if it could someday become a story. But before any of that, before ambition, before books, before politics, before war, his first enemy was not another person. It was his own breath. From the earliest years of childhood, his lungs seemed unwilling to obey the simple rhythm that most people take for granted. The ordinary nights could suddenly become frightening. He would wake gasping, his chest tightening, his face changing color as air refused to come easily. The room would fill with alarm. Servants hurried. His mother worried. His father appeared at once, determined to do something, anything, rather than watch his son suffer helplessly. Today, we would give that illness a familiar name, but in those days, understanding was limited, treatment uncertain, and hope often improvised in the dark. Doctors offered theories with the confidence of men who did not really know. Some blamed nerves, some blamed cold air, some blamed diet, weather, weakness, or the mysterious constitution of the child himself. The family tried medicines, changes of environment, fresh air, rest, movement, and every suggestion that sounded even slightly possible. Each remedy brought a little hope, and then, too often, another night of fear. Imagine being very young and learning that breathing, the most basic promise of life, could suddenly become a battle. Imagine discovering that your own body could turn against you without warning. One moment, the world is ordinary. The next, every thought narrows into the desperate need for one more breath. Adults may speak gently, lamps may be lit, blankets may be arranged, but inside the child, something older than language awakens. The terror is simple. What if the next breath does not come? What if this time the body does not return? During the worst attacks, his father developed a ritual that would remain carved into the boy's memory. He would wrap his son in blankets, carry him out into the night, and place him in a carriage. Then the horses would surge forward through the dark streets of Manhattan, their hooves striking stone while cold air rushed around the frightened child. Perhaps the movement would help, Perhaps the night air would open the lungs. Perhaps speed itself could become medicine. Most of the time, it did little, but the father kept trying. There is something heartbreaking in that image. A powerful man, respected by society, unable to command the illness, leaving his son breathless, a little boy pressed against blankets, listening to horses in the darkness, a city asleep around them, unaware that one family was fighting a private war beneath the gas lamps. And at the center of it all, a lesson forming before the child could fully explain it. When fear arrives, you do not simply wait for it to pass. You move, you act, you fight. Even when you do not know whether fighting will work. That lesson entered him deeply. It did not cure him, but it shaped him. The body remained fragile. The attacks returned. The weakness stayed close, like an unwelcome companion. He could not run as other boys ran. He could not join every game. Rough play exhausted him. Ordinary childhood pleasures were often watched from the side, rather than experienced from within. And because children are often honest in the cruelest ways, other boys noticed. They saw the thin frame, the strange energy, the vulnerability, the inability to fight back. Weakness, when seen by the wrong eyes, becomes an invitation. He was mocked. He was pushed. He was made to feel small in the presence of boys who had done nothing to earn their strength, except be born with it. One humiliation especially remained with him, the kind of memory that does not fade because it does not merely hurt the body. It asks a question that follows a child into adulthood. What kind of man can you become if you cannot defend yourself? What kind of life is possible when fear teaches you to lower your eyes? His eyesight made the world even more uncertain. For years, distant objects appeared blurred, though he did not understand that others saw them clearly. Faces across a room lacked sharpness. Birds in the trees were little more than movements among leaves. Signs, landscapes, details, all softened into uncertainty beyond a short distance. The world was there, rich and vivid, but it reached him through a veil. Later, when glasses corrected his vision, the beauty of ordinary things would astonish him. But in childhood, he lived partly inside a fog. So he turned inward, and then toward books. If his body betrayed him, his mind offered a country where he could still move freely. He read with hunger. Adventure, natural history, military stories, animals, geography, anything that opened a door beyond the sick room. Books did not demand strong lungs. They did not laugh when he stumbled. They allowed him to travel where his body could not yet go. In their pages, courage seemed possible. Danger had shape. Heroes could suffer and still continue. The world became larger, but also more organized. He began collecting specimens with the seriousness of a tiny scholar. Insects, shells, stones, feathers, small remains of animals. Anything that could be studied, named, arranged, and understood. His room became a private museum, a sanctuary of order, built by a child who often felt powerless inside disorder. Other families might have objected to such strange treasures appearing in drawers and corners, but his family tolerated the habit, perhaps because they understood that curiosity was more than a pastime for him. It was a way of surviving. There is a quiet dignity in a child, trying to build strength from whatever materials life has left within reach. Some children build forts. Some collect coins. Some chase balls across fields. He built knowledge. He learned names, patterns, behaviors, histories. Each fact became a small brick in the wall he was raising against helplessness. If he could not yet command his body, he could command information. If he could not win in the street, he could win in memory, observation, and attention. The mind became his first weapon. Still, intelligence did not remove the ache. A child may love books and still long to run. He may memorize the names of birds and still wish he could chase them across open grass. Many evenings, after another attack had faded, after the house had settled again into cautious calm, he must have felt the distance between the life he had and the life he wanted. Outside, other children shouted and played. Inside, he listened. The window separated more than rooms from streets. It separated weakness from vitality. And yet, in that ache, the future was already beginning. The boy did not know it, but every humiliation, every sleepless night, every desperate carriage ride, every blurred tree, every page read under lamplight, was preparing the inner machinery of a man who would later seem impossible to stop. Great lives often begin not with strength, but with the private knowledge of what it means to lack it. The world would one day see his confidence, his appetite for struggle, his almost theatrical courage. But before the theater, there was the wound. Then came the conversation that would become the central turning point of his childhood. His father, the man he admired above all others, called him aside and spoke with a directness that might sound severe to modern ears. He did not flatter the boy. He did not pretend that intelligence alone would be enough. He told him, in essence, that his mind was strong, but his body was not, and that without the body, the mind could not travel as far as it should. The conclusion was simple and enormous. He would have to make his body. For another child, those words might have landed like a sentence. For him, they became a commandment. There are moments in life when a single sentence divides before from after. This was one of them. His father was not saying that weakness made him worthless. He was saying that weakness could not be allowed to remain the ruler of his life. The boy heard not rejection, but invitation. He had been given a task large enough to organize his pain. If the body was unfinished, then he would build it. A small gymnasium was arranged for him at home. There were weights, bars, equipment for pulling, lifting, striking, stretching, and enduring. To anyone else, it might have looked like a modest collection of tools. To the boy, it was the beginning of a private revolution. Day after day, he worked. Not elegantly, not easily, not with sudden transformation. He lifted until his muscles trembled. He pulled himself upward with arms that had little strength. He struck the punching bag until exhaustion overtook pride. Progress came slowly, almost invisibly. That slowness mattered. If strength had arrived quickly, it might have taught him the wrong lesson. Instead, he learned that change is often boring before it becomes beautiful. It is repetition without applause, effort without witnesses, discomfort without immediate reward. The body does not become strong because the heart makes a dramatic promise. It becomes strong because the promise returns the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. His childhood training was not merely physical. It taught him the rhythm of becoming. He also began to learn boxing, not because he expected to become a great fighter, but because he could no longer tolerate the feeling of helplessness. Boxing gave shape to fear. It taught him where to place his feet, how to raise his hands, how to absorb pain without surrendering balance. Every blow carried a lesson. Every mistake had a consequence. He was not naturally gifted. He did not move with effortless grace, but he possessed something more stubborn than talent. He possessed the refusal to quit. Slowly, the fragile child began to change. The transformation was real, though never complete. His asthma did not vanish like a villain defeated in a simple story. His eyesight still required help. His body would always carry traces of its early rebellion. But something more important had shifted. He no longer saw himself merely as a victim of his limitations. He had discovered that effort could alter the terms of the struggle, not erase pain, not guarantee victory, but give a person some claim over his own fate. This belief would become both his strength and his danger. It would push him toward greatness, but it would also make him impatient with weakness in others. Because he had fought his way out of helplessness, he sometimes assumed that everyone else could do the same, if only they tried hard enough. This is one of the complicated truths about extraordinary people. The wound that gives them power can also narrow their mercy. The boy who learned to make his body would become a man who worshipped effort almost as a religion. But for now, he was still only a child standing at the edge of possibility. The world beyond his home was waiting. There would be ships, foreign cities, deserts, museums, mountains, books, love, grief, politics, war, and the long restless road toward power. Yet the foundation had already been laid. Before he entered any public arena, he had entered the arena of himself. Before he fought corporations, armies, or political machines, he fought the frightening silence inside his own lungs. And in that first battle, the shape of his destiny began to appear. The discipline that slowly reshaped his body also began to reshape the way he looked at the world. Each morning brought another opportunity to test himself against yesterday, rather than against other people. There were no cheering spectators inside the small gymnasium. No applause followed another completed exercise. Only the quiet sound of effort echoed through the room. Over time, he discovered something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Real transformation rarely announces itself. It grows silently, hidden beneath ordinary days that seem almost identical, until one morning a person realizes that the impossible no longer feels quite so impossible. His father watched this change with quiet satisfaction. He never demanded perfection, only persistence. Whenever the young boy became discouraged by slow progress, his father reminded him that strength was never a gift handed down by chance. It was something earned one difficult day after another. Those conversations were not long speeches filled with dramatic wisdom. They were simple moments between a father and a son. Moments that carried more weight because they were lived instead of performed. As the months passed, the boy who had once feared almost every physical challenge gradually began searching for them. He still suffered from illness. There were mornings when breathing remained difficult, and evenings when exhaustion settled over him without warning. But he no longer believed weakness had the final word. Instead of asking why life had made him fragile, he began asking what he could still become, despite that fragility. The difference between those two questions changed the direction of his entire future. Outside the walls of the family home, New York continued its restless march toward modernity. Construction crews carved fresh streets through neighborhoods that had once been quiet farmland. Ships arrived every day carrying families from distant countries, each hoping that the city might offer opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Languages mixed together in crowded markets. Elegant carriages rolled past children selling newspapers on street corners. Wealth and hardship existed side by side, separated sometimes by nothing more than a single block. The young boy observed all of it with unusual attention. Because illness had often forced him to slow down, he noticed details that hurried people ignored. He watched the expressions of workers returning home after sunset. He listened carefully when older relatives discussed politics around the dinner table. He found himself fascinated not only by nature, but also by human behavior. Why did some people surrender after failure, while others seemed almost strengthened by disappointment? The question lingered quietly in his mind, long before he had any answer. Books continued to occupy much of his free time. They became windows opening toward places his body had not yet visited. He wandered through ancient civilizations, followed explorers across unfamiliar continents, and stood beside famous commanders on distant battlefields, all without leaving his chair. History no longer felt like a list of dates. It became a collection of living people who had faced fear, uncertainty, ambition, loss, and impossible choices. He began to understand that greatness was rarely born from comfort. Almost every remarkable life seemed to begin with some hidden struggle. His fascination with the natural world grew alongside his love of history. Birds especially captured his imagination. He studied their movements patiently, recording small observations that most adults would have dismissed as trivial. Each feather seemed to tell a story about survival. Each migration suggested that the world was far larger than the streets surrounding his home. While other children hurried through parks in search of entertainment, he searched for patterns, quietly training the habit of observation that would later serve him in politics, exploration, and leadership. One family journey changed him in ways he could never have predicted. Traveling across Europe exposed him to landscapes, museums, castles, and cities, unlike anything he had imagined while reading alone at home. Every destination seemed to whisper that civilization was built layer upon layer, generation after generation. Old churches stood beside lively markets. Ancient ruins overlooked modern streets. History was no longer confined to printed pages. It surrounded him, visible in stone, art, language, and memory. During that journey, another discovery quietly transformed his daily experience. After years of struggling to see distant objects, someone finally recognized that his eyesight required correction. When he first looked through properly fitted spectacles, the world appeared almost new. Leaves emerged individually instead of blending into green clouds. Distant faces gained expression. Birds that had once been blurred shadows suddenly revealed delicate markings and graceful movements. He later remembered that moment as though an invisible curtain had been lifted from reality itself. The change affected more than his vision. It deepened his curiosity. Now that he could truly observe the world, he wanted to understand it even more completely. Notebooks filled with careful sketches, descriptions of animals, reflections about landscapes, and observations gathered during long walks. Writing became another form of exploration. It allowed him to preserve moments that would otherwise disappear into memory. Without realizing it, he was teaching himself how to tell stories through detail rather than exaggeration. Yet growing knowledge did not erase every flaw in his character. Confidence arrived more quickly than maturity. After years of feeling physically inferior, he sometimes overcompensated by displaying excessive certainty about subjects he had only recently begun studying. He corrected teachers too eagerly, argued with adults without hesitation, and occasionally mistook enthusiasm for wisdom. Those around him noticed both qualities at once. His curiosity was genuine, but so was his impatience. The same determination that helped him overcome weakness could also make him difficult to challenge. Fortunately, life possesses a remarkable ability to humble those who move too quickly toward certainty. Every new experience revealed another horizon he had not yet explored. Every accomplished scholar reminded him how much remained unknown. Every journey introduced customs and ideas different from his own. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to understand that intelligence was not measured by always having the answer. Sometimes it was measured by remaining curious, long after others believed they already knew enough. Through adolescence, his daily routine became almost ritualistic. Reading strengthened his mind. Exercise strengthened his body. Long walks strengthened his endurance. Observation strengthened his judgment. None of these habits appeared extraordinary on their own, yet together they formed the quiet architecture of a remarkable future. Many people later admired the fearless public figure, without realizing that his greatest victories had first been won in complete privacy. long before newspapers ever learned his name. Those early years also shaped his relationship with hardship. Pain gradually lost some of its power to frighten him because it had become familiar. Discomfort no longer signaled failure. Instead, it became evidence that growth was taking place. This philosophy would accompany him into every chapter of adulthood, whether climbing mountains, confronting political rivals, exploring dangerous frontiers, or facing personal tragedy. He would repeatedly return to the same simple belief formed during childhood. Life rarely rewards those who wait for ideal conditions before acting. As the years passed, friends and relatives noticed a remarkable transformation. The frail child, who had once struggled to keep pace during ordinary activities, now walked with growing confidence. His shoulders appeared stronger. His voice carried greater certainty. Although illness never disappeared completely, it no longer defined the boundaries of his identity. He had stopped measuring himself by what his body refused to do, and started measuring himself by the effort he invested each day. That quiet change, more than any physical improvement, marked the true beginning of the man he would eventually become. Still, destiny had only begun preparing him. Beyond the comfort of home-weighted universities, unexpected friendships, heartbreaking loss, distant wilderness, political conflict, and responsibilities far greater than any child could imagine. The lessons of discipline and perseverance had built a foundation, but foundations exist for only one reason. Sooner or later, life begins constructing everything that stands upon them. When the time finally came to leave home and begin his education beyond the shelter of familiar walls, he carried far more than books in his luggage. He carried years of private battles that no one outside his family could fully understand. The world would see a young man from a respected household, confident, energetic, and eager to learn. Only he knew how many sleepless nights, painful mornings, and quiet disappointments had shaped the person now stepping toward adulthood. Every new beginning is built upon invisible foundations, and his were deeper than most. College introduced him to a different kind of challenge. No longer was he measured only by discipline or curiosity. Now, he entered a place where intelligence competed with intelligence, where nearly every student had grown up believing that success was already waiting somewhere ahead. Family names opened certain doors, wealth removed many obstacles, and social confidence often mattered as much as academic ability. For someone who had spent years teaching himself resilience, it was an unfamiliar landscape filled with unwritten rules. At first, he did not fit comfortably into that world. He spoke with unusual intensity, becoming completely absorbed whenever a subject captured his attention. Conversations that others considered casual quickly became passionate debates in his hands. While many students carefully measured every word in order to appear polished, he often forgot appearances altogether. Once curiosity took control, some classmates admired his enthusiasm. Others quietly laughed at it. They found him awkward, overly serious, and occasionally exhausting. Rather than changing himself to gain approval, he continued following his own interests. He spent long hours reading far beyond the assigned lessons. He wandered through museums whenever time allowed, studied wildlife during walks outside the city, and filled notebooks with observations that had little connection to classroom examinations. Education, for him, had never been about collecting grades. It was about satisfying an appetite that seemed impossible to quiet. Each new subject only revealed another 100 questions waiting beyond it. Those habits slowly attracted a different circle of companions. Instead of seeking popularity, he found people who appreciated genuine curiosity. Conversations stretched late into the evening, moving effortlessly from literature to history, from science to politics, from philosophy to the changing future of the United States. Among these friendships, he discovered something almost as valuable as knowledge itself. He discovered intellectual companionship. Ideas became livelier when shared, challenged, defended, and refined through honest disagreement. Despite this growing confidence, another battle quietly continued inside him. Physical training remained part of nearly every day. While classmates relaxed after lectures or attended social gatherings, he often returned to exercise with the same determination that had defined his childhood. Boxing became more than recreation. It became a conversation between fear and courage. Every punch absorbed reminded him that pain could be survived. Every difficult practice whispered the same lesson his father had planted years before. The body is not fixed. It can be shaped by repeated effort. Still, there were moments when the old insecurity returned unexpectedly. One careless remark from another student, one reminder of childhood weakness, one disappointing day during training could awaken memories he believed had already disappeared. Growth is rarely a straight line. Even those who appear fearless often carry forgotten versions of themselves somewhere beneath the surface. His younger self, the frightened boy struggling for breath, never completely vanished. Instead, that child quietly walked beside him, reminding him why surrender could never become an acceptable choice. During these years, another passion steadily expanded until it became impossible to ignore. And history no longer interested him, merely as a collection of famous names. He became fascinated by the decisions hidden behind great events. Why did certain leaders inspire loyalty, while others ruled through fear? Why did civilizations rise with confidence, only to collapse under their own success? Why did ordinary individuals sometimes alter the direction of entire nations? These questions slowly pulled his attention away from natural history and toward public life. The more he studied, the more he realized that leadership demanded far more than intelligence. Knowledge could explain the past, but character determined the future. History repeatedly rewarded those willing to act, while others hesitated. It punished indecision almost as severely as ignorance. This realization resonated deeply with everything he had already learned through illness and discipline. Action, even imperfect action, often proved more powerful than endless caution. The idea settled into his thinking so naturally that he barely noticed it becoming part of his identity. Then life reminded him that no amount of preparation protects anyone from grief. News arrived that his father had fallen seriously ill. For a young man whose greatest hero had always been waiting at home, the possibility seemed almost unimaginable. Strength had always worn his father's face. Wisdom had spoken with his father's voice. Whenever uncertainty appeared, he had unconsciously measured himself against the example of that remarkable man. Now, for the first time, he confronted the possibility that such guidance might not always remain within reach. He hurried home carrying hope that everything would somehow return to normal. Hope, however, does not always arrive before reality. His father's condition continued to worsen, and despite every effort, the family understood that time was running painfully short. The conversations became quieter. Ordinary routines disappeared. Every familiar room inside the family home seemed transformed by uncertainty. There are moments when even the strongest families discover that love alone cannot negotiate with mortality. When death finally came, it left a silence unlike anything the young man had experienced before. Throughout childhood, his father had represented certainty itself, the person who always knew what should be done next. Suddenly, that certainty vanished. The world looked strangely unfamiliar, without the reassuring presence that had guided him for so many years. Grief entered not with dramatic violence, but with a heavy stillness, settling into ordinary days and making even familiar routines feel distant. For weeks he struggled to understand who he should become without the person he had spent his entire life trying to resemble. Many young people lose parents. Yet each loss is unique because every relationship is unique. He mourned not only a father but also a mentor, a teacher, a protector, and the living example of the kind of man he hoped someday to become. It seemed impossible that such a voice could simply disappear from the world. Instead of withdrawing from responsibility, he responded in the only way he knew. He worked harder. Books multiplied across his desk. Long walks became longer. Exercise became even more demanding. He buried sorrow beneath movement, convincing himself that action could carry him through emotions too painful to examine directly. Whether this approach truly healed him remained uncertain, but it allowed him to keep moving forward. Sometimes, survival begins not with understanding grief, but with refusing to let grief become the only story being told. Friends noticed the change. Beneath his familiar enthusiasm now rested a quieter seriousness. His laughter still appeared, yet it arrived less easily. Conversations about ambition gradually shifted toward conversations about purpose. Success no longer seemed valuable merely because it brought recognition. It mattered because it offered the opportunity to honor the principles his father had lived by: public service, integrity, courage, and responsibility slowly transformed from admirable ideas into deeply personal obligations. Around this same period, another unexpected influence entered his life. Love rarely arrives according to careful plans, and certainly not according to logical timing. He met a young woman whose warmth balanced his restless energy in surprising ways. Where he rushed toward every challenge with determined intensity, she possessed an effortless grace that calmed those around her. Conversations with her felt different from the intellectual debates he enjoyed with classmates. They reminded him that life contained beauty beyond achievement. Their relationship developed gradually, filled with uncertainty, hope, and moments of quiet hesitation. For perhaps the first time since childhood, determination alone could not guarantee the outcome he desired. Affection could not be demanded through effort. Trust required patience. Understanding required listening. Love introduced him to a different kind of courage, one that asked not for strength of body or certainty of opinion, but for vulnerability. The lesson proved far more difficult than lifting weights or stepping into a boxing ring. Looking back years later, he might have recognized that these experiences formed another invisible turning point. Childhood had taught him how to overcome physical weakness. Education had taught him how to discipline his mind. Grief now taught him humility, while love quietly reminded him that even the strongest people remain deeply dependent upon others. The confident young student standing at the threshold of adulthood could not yet imagine the storms waiting ahead, but the person who would eventually face them was already taking shape, one ordinary day at a time. Without realizing it, he had entered the final years, before destiny would begin asking far greater things of him. The quiet libraries would soon give way to crowded legislative halls. Peaceful walks through the countryside would eventually be replaced by difficult journeys across untamed landscapes. Private reflection would surrender its place to public responsibility, and beyond every success waited losses that no amount of discipline could prevent. Yet those chapters belonged to another season. For now, the future remained unseen, gathering patiently beyond the horizon like the first light before dawn. The path that had once seemed uncertain now began unfolding with unexpected speed. After years spent strengthening both his mind and his body, he found himself standing before a question that many young people eventually face. What kind of life deserved his energy? He admired scholars whose discoveries expanded human understanding. He respected explorers who accepted hardship in exchange for knowledge. He looked with fascination at soldiers who placed duty above comfort. Each possibility seemed meaningful, yet none felt complete. Somewhere beyond those familiar professions waited a calling he had not yet recognized. The nation around him was changing as quickly as he was. Factories multiplied across growing cities, railroads stitched distant regions together, and new industries created fortunes that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. With prosperity came deeper inequality. Wealth accumulated in remarkable quantities, while many laborers struggled to provide even the simplest necessities for their families. Newspapers carried stories of political corruption beside reports celebrating economic progress. America appeared energetic, ambitious, and optimistic. Yet beneath that confidence flowed currents of tension that few fully understood. He followed these developments with growing interest. Unlike many young men of comfortable upbringing, he refused to believe that public affairs belonged only to professional politicians. He saw government as something deeply connected to ordinary families, honest work, and everyday opportunity. If laws could improve lives, then ignoring politics meant allowing others to decide the future without challenge. Gradually, the idea settled within him that citizenship demanded participation rather than observation. Reading about history was no longer enough. Perhaps one day he would have to help shape it. Those thoughts became stronger each time he returned to the neighborhoods beyond his own social circle. Elegant homes existed only a short distance from crowded streets where children worked long hours and families lived under conditions few wealthy citizens ever witnessed firsthand. He observed not only poverty, but also resilience. People laughed despite hardship. Parents sacrificed quietly for their children. Workers rose before sunrise, knowing that another difficult day awaited them. These scenes complicated his understanding of success. Prosperity alone could never measure the health of a nation. At the same time, his lifelong habit of writing continued to deepen. Every journey produced fresh journal entries. Every conversation sparked another page of reflection. He wrote, not because anyone expected him to publish his thoughts, but because writing allowed scattered observations to become clearer. The discipline resembled physical training in an unexpected way. Each sentence strengthened the habit of thinking carefully. Each revision demanded honesty. Over time, he realized that language itself could become a form of leadership. Ideas expressed with clarity possessed the quiet power to move hearts long before they changed laws. The friends occasionally teased him about the intensity with which he approached almost everything. A leisurely walk somehow became an expedition. A simple discussion turned into an enthusiastic lecture. A casual interest quickly transformed into determined study. He laughed along with them, yet deep inside he recognized something he could not easily change. Moderation had never felt natural to him. When curiosity appeared, it consumed him completely. When responsibility called, he answered with every ounce of energy available. Balance, admirable though it might be, rarely described the rhythm of his life. That relentless temperament attracted opportunities as often as it created difficulties. Older mentors noticed his unusual dedication and began offering advice that few young men received so early. They encouraged him to think beyond personal success and consider how his abilities might serve the broader public. Some suggested law. Others recommended scholarship. A few quietly hinted that politics, despite its flaws, needed individuals who valued principle above convenience. He listened carefully, without making immediate decisions. Experience had already taught him that the most important choices deserved patience. During this period, another realization slowly emerged. Courage existed in many forms. As a child, he believed bravery belonged only to explorers, soldiers, and athletes. Later, he discovered that moral courage often demanded even greater strength. Speaking honestly when silence offered safety, required discipline. Defending unpopular convictions carried consequences no boxing match could equal. Standing against corruption meant accepting criticism from powerful people who preferred comfortable compromise. These lessons fascinated him because they expanded his understanding of what it truly meant to live fearlessly. His interest in leadership also changed the way he read history. Instead of asking who won battles, he asked why ordinary people chose to follow certain leaders. Military victories mattered, yet character seemed to matter even more. Some rulers inspired obedience through fear. Others awakened loyalty through example. The distinction stayed with him. He became convinced that authority earned through integrity endured far longer than authority protected by intimidation. This belief would later shape countless decisions throughout his public life, though he did not yet realize how often it would be tested. Even as his ambitions grew, he never completely escaped the memory of physical weakness. There were mornings when old breathing difficulties returned unexpectedly, reminding him that past struggles never vanish entirely. Rather than discouraging him, these moments reinforced gratitude. Every healthy day felt like a gift, rather than an entitlement. Every demanding journey became another opportunity to prove that yesterday's limitations did not have to dictate tomorrow's possibilities. Resilience had become less of a goal and more of a habit. Those closest to him noticed another subtle transformation. He had become a better listener. The confident student, who once rushed to display every new idea, gradually learned the value of silence. Older relatives shared stories he might previously have interrupted. Workers described experiences entirely different from his own. Travelers recounted hardships that no textbook could fully capture. Listening expanded his world more effectively than speaking ever could. Wisdom, he discovered, often entered quietly, while pride insisted on making noise. Love continued to mature alongside these personal changes. The relationship that had begun with cautious admiration gradually developed into genuine partnership. Conversations extended beyond romance toward questions about purpose, family, and the future they hoped to build together. She possessed a calming influence that balanced his restless ambition without diminishing it. Around her, he felt less pressure to prove himself. Perhaps for the first time since childhood, he experienced the comfort of being accepted without needing to earn that acceptance through achievement. Yet beneath those peaceful moments lingered an awareness that life seldom remains gentle for long. History moved quickly, and nations rarely paused, simply because individuals wished for stability. Economic disputes intensified. Political arguments grew sharper. Newspapers filled their pages with accusations, scandals, and competing visions of America's future. The young man reading those headlines sensed that his generation would eventually inherit responsibilities larger than personal ambition. Whether he wished it or not, the country itself was calling for new voices. He often walked alone during the evenings, allowing long hours of quiet reflection to organize thoughts that daily activity scattered. Beneath wide skies and fading sunlight, he considered the strange path that had brought him from a frightened child, struggling for breath, to a healthy young adult, searching for meaningful work. Nothing about that journey had been easy. Nothing important had arrived quickly. Perhaps that was precisely why he trusted effort more than talent. Talent could impress people. Effort could transform them. One evening, while watching the last light disappear beyond the horizon, he recognized a truth that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Comfort had never taught him his greatest lessons. Every lasting change had emerged from seasons of uncertainty, disappointment, discipline, or loss. Suffering itself was never desirable, but refusing to surrender within suffering possessed extraordinary power. That conviction settled quietly into his character, becoming less an opinion than a permanent way of seeing the world. Before long, opportunity would appear in a form few around him expected. It would invite him away from the predictable future imagined by friends and relatives. Many would question the wisdom of his decision. Others would dismiss it as youthful idealism. But hidden inside that unexpected choice lay the beginning of a public life that would eventually reshape not only his own destiny, but also the destiny of an entire nation. The careful preparation of childhood and youth had reached its conclusion. The next chapter would ask him not merely to build himself, but to test the person he had become against the demands of the real world. The invitation arrived without fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no prophetic signs, no sense that history had quietly opened a new door. It appeared much like countless opportunities that passed through every generation. Ordinary enough that many people might have ignored it. Yet the direction of a life is often decided by moments that seem almost insignificant while they are happening. When he accepted his first role in public service, he did not believe he was stepping toward greatness. He believed he was simply answering a responsibility that had been growing inside him for years. His earliest days in government quickly dissolved many youthful illusions. From a distance, politics had appeared to be a place where ideas competed honestly, and the strongest arguments naturally prevailed. Reality proved far more complicated. Conversations often continued long after principals had quietly left the room. Personal loyalties shaped important decisions, and favors traveled silently through crowded hallways. Compromise, sometimes wise and sometimes deeply disappointing, appeared almost everywhere he looked. The machinery of government moved, but not always for the reasons described in public speeches. Instead of becoming discouraged, he became curious. Every institution reflected the character of the people working inside it. If corruption existed, someone had tolerated it. If integrity survived, someone had defended it. He realized that systems were not mysterious forces beyond human control. They were built one decision at a time and weakened in exactly the same way. That understanding strengthened his resolve. Changing a nation would never begin with grand declarations. It would begin with countless ordinary choices made consistently over many years. Older politicians observed the energetic newcomer with mixed emotions. Some appreciated his honesty. Others considered him hopelessly idealistic. They smiled politely when he spoke about accountability and public trust, quietly assuming that experience would eventually soften his convictions. Many had entered public life carrying similar hopes before discovering how easily ambition could replace principle. They expected time to reshape him into someone more predictable. Few imagined that the opposite would happen, that the system itself would soon feel the pressure of his relentless determination. He approached every assignment with the habits formed during childhood. Reports were not skimmed, but studied carefully. Meetings were not attended merely to be seen, but to understand. Questions multiplied because curiosity had never learned to remain silent. Where others accepted familiar explanations, he searched for original evidence. Where rumors circulated freely, he preferred verified facts. This method demanded longer hours and greater effort, yet it gradually earned him something more valuable than popularity. It earned credibility. Outside official duties, he continued writing almost every day. Journals filled with observations about cities, people, conversations, and the strange contrast between public appearances and private motivations. He believed that memory could not always be trusted, so he trained himself to record details while they remained fresh. Years later, those pages would become invaluable, preserving not only events, but also emotions that might otherwise have faded into comfortable simplification. Writing remained the quiet companion that had followed him since childhood, asking him to slow down even while life accelerated. Although his schedule grew increasingly demanding, he refused to abandon physical discipline. Dawn often found him walking long distances before others had even begun their day. Whenever possible, he boxed, lifted weights, or rode through the countryside, simply to remind himself that leadership required endurance as much as intelligence. He feared comfort more than exhaustion. Comfort, he believed, slowly persuaded capable people that they had already done enough. Exhaustion, by contrast, usually meant they were still moving towards something worthwhile. His colleagues occasionally wondered where such endless energy originated. Some assumed unusual talent. Others suspected ambition alone. Too few understood that the true source reached much further into the past. Every difficult morning recalled childhood battles for breath. Every demanding journey echoed those nights, when survival itself had felt uncertain because he remembered weakness so clearly. He treated strength not as a permanent possession, but as a daily responsibility. Gratitude became one of the hidden engines driving his remarkable pace. Public attention arrived gradually rather than suddenly. Local newspapers began mentioning his work with cautious respect. Community leaders noticed his willingness to meet ordinary citizens instead of limiting his conversations to influential figures. Factory workers, merchants, teachers, veterans, and young students all discovered that he listened with genuine interest. He rarely promised easy solutions, yet people sensed an unusual sincerity. In an era when polished speeches often concealed private bargains, authenticity possessed surprising power. Not everyone welcomed this growing reputation. Individuals who benefited from familiar arrangements viewed energetic reformers with understandable suspicion. Criticism appeared in newspapers. Whispers questioned his motives. Some dismissed him as inexperienced, while others argued that his enthusiasm would eventually fade, like that of countless young idealists before him. He read many of these attacks with calm determination. Disagreement no longer frightened him. Childhood had taught him that approval was an unreliable foundation upon which to build a meaningful life. During quiet evenings, he often reflected upon the strange path that had carried him from a fragile boyhood into increasingly demanding public responsibilities. Success still felt uncertain. Mistakes remained inevitable. Yet one conviction had become unshakable. Character was not revealed during moments of comfort. It emerged when conviction collided with consequence. Every difficult decision offered another opportunity, either to preserve integrity or quietly exchange it for convenience. He hoped that when those moments arrived, he would recognize them before they quietly passed. Life, however, was preparing challenges far more personal than political disagreement. No amount of discipline could shield a human heart from unexpected sorrow, and no carefully planned future remained untouched forever. Beyond the encouraging headlines, beyond promising opportunities and growing respect, events already moved silently toward him that would test not his intelligence nor his courage, but his capacity to endure profound loss without surrendering the purpose that had slowly shaped his entire life. The next season would ask a question that neither books nor ambition could answer, and the response would redefine the man he was still becoming. There are seasons in every life when the future appears almost generous. Work becomes meaningful, trusted friendships deepen, and the path ahead seems to stretch forward with reassuring clarity. He entered one of those seasons believing that persistence had finally begun to reward years of discipline. Opportunities continued to appear. His reputation slowly expanded, and the quiet confidence that had taken so long to build no longer felt fragile. For the first time since childhood, he allowed himself to imagine that perhaps the hardest chapters were already behind him. To life, however, often waits until hope feels secure before reminding us how little we truly control. Marriage brought a kind of happiness he had never experienced before. Home was no longer simply the place where he recovered from demanding days. It became a refuge where ambition could rest without needing to defend itself. Conversations wandered from public affairs to dreams for the future, from family traditions to the simple pleasures that ambitious people often forget to notice. There was laughter around the dinner table, quiet evenings filled with books, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary routines. These moments would later remain among his most treasured memories, because they asked nothing of him except to be present. Friends noticed that success seemed to soften certain edges of his personality. Although his determination remained unmistakable, it was now balanced by warmth and patience. He had learned that influence did not always require intensity. Sometimes genuine kindness accomplished what argument never could. Younger colleagues sought his advice, older mentors offered greater trust, and even political opponents occasionally admitted that his convictions appeared sincere. Respect, unlike popularity, arrived slowly, earned through countless consistent actions rather than dramatic speeches. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, he continued pushing himself harder than anyone expected. He refused to believe that achievement justified comfort. Every morning still began with movement. Long walks, demanding exercise, careful reading, and disciplined writing remained fixed parts of his routine, regardless of weather or exhaustion. People often described him as energetic, but energy alone did not explain his habits. He feared becoming complacent more than he feared failure. Somewhere deep inside, the frightened child, who had once struggled simply to breathe, continued whispering that nothing valuable should ever be taken for granted. His growing responsibilities exposed him to countless stories carried by ordinary citizens. Farmers spoke about uncertain harvests. Laborers described dangerous working conditions. Business owners worried about unpredictable markets. Veterans carried invisible memories that few others could understand. Each conversation reinforced the same lesson. Leadership was not about standing above people. It required standing close enough to hear concerns that official reports rarely captured. He became increasingly convinced that the distance between government and everyday life should never become too wide. The more he traveled, the more fascinated he became by the extraordinary diversity of the country itself. Forests stretched beyond the horizon with an almost sacred silence. Rivers carved their patient paths through ancient valleys. Bustling towns gave way to isolated farms where families depended entirely upon one another. Each landscape revealed another version of America, each community another perspective on hope, hardship, and perseverance. Nature offered him peace, while people reminded him why that peace deserved protection. He often carried a notebook wherever he traveled. While companions hurried toward the next destination, he paused to record impressions that others overlooked. The changing color of evening light across distant hills, the expression on an elderly worker's face after finishing a difficult day, the quiet dignity of families gathering together before sunset. These details mattered because they transformed history from abstract events into deeply human experiences. He believed that nations were ultimately built not by institutions alone, but by millions of ordinary lives, unfolding quietly beyond public attention. Just as confidence seemed strongest, life shifted without warning. Illness entered the family unexpectedly, at first appearing manageable, then gradually becoming impossible to ignore. Days once filled with optimism became consumed by anxious conversations, hurried visits, and uncertain medical opinions. Hope remained present, yet it slowly changed its character. Instead of expecting complete recovery, loved ones began hoping merely for another peaceful morning, another shared conversation, another opportunity to postpone the inevitable. Those long hours beside a sickbed revealed a different kind of courage than any public office could demand. There were no audiences to witness quiet devotion, No applause for sleepless nights. No newspaper articles describing private acts of tenderness. True love often expresses itself through remarkably ordinary gestures, holding a hand, reading aloud from a favorite book, sitting together in silence because words have become too small for what the heart wishes to say. He discovered that these moments required every bit as much strength as confronting powerful political opponents. When loss finally arrived, it shattered the comforting illusion that discipline alone could protect a person from suffering. Grief ignored preparation. It cared nothing for intelligence, reputation, or determination. One ordinary day became permanently divided into before and after. Rooms that had recently echoed with conversation now felt impossibly quiet. Familiar objects suddenly carried unbearable memories. Even sunlight entering through the windows seemed strangely unfamiliar, as though the world itself had shifted while everyone else continued pretending that nothing had changed. For many weeks, he moved through daily routines, almost automatically. Friends expressed sympathy, colleagues offered patience, relatives remained close whenever possible. Yet grief possesses a loneliness that cannot be entirely shared. Every person must eventually walk through it alone. He discovered that sorrow rarely follows a predictable path. Some mornings arrived with unexpected calm, only to surrender by evening to memories so vivid they seemed almost impossible to bear. Healing refused to follow any schedule. More than once, he considered abandoning everything that had once seemed important. Ambition suddenly appeared, strangely empty, beside irreversible loss. Speeches, elections, reforms, and public recognition all seemed insignificant when measured against the silence waiting at home. There are moments when even the strongest individuals question whether purpose itself has disappeared. He stood dangerously close to that question, uncertain whether the future still contained anything worth pursuing. Instead of seeking comfort among familiar surroundings, he chose distance, not because running away could erase grief, but because movement had always helped him think more honestly. He traveled toward places where the landscape itself demanded attention. Broad skies replaced crowded streets. Open country replaced political conversation. The natural world asked nothing of him except endurance. There, surrounded by wind, rivers, forests, and endless horizons, he gradually rediscovered something that sorrow had nearly hidden. Nature possessed an extraordinary indifference to human tragedy. The sun continued rising. Birds greeted the morning exactly as they always had. Rivers carried yesterday's rain toward distant oceans without pausing to acknowledge personal heartbreak. At first, this indifference felt almost cruel. Eventually, it became comforting. The world continued, not because grief lacked importance, but because life itself insisted upon moving forward. He began understanding that honoring those we lose does not always mean remaining beside the place where sorrow first found us. Long, solitary rides and quiet evenings beneath open skies slowly restored his ability to breathe emotionally, as childhood discipline had once restored his physical confidence. Memories remained painful, yet they no longer prevented him from imagining tomorrow. He realized that grief could become either a permanent prison or a deeper source of compassion. Suffering had expanded his understanding of other people in ways success never could. Every stranger carried invisible battles. Every smile might conceal private heartache. Judgment became more difficult, while empathy became almost unavoidable. When he eventually returned to public life, those around him noticed a subtle but unmistakable change. The relentless energy remained, yet it was now accompanied by greater patience. Victories no longer excited him as easily, and criticism no longer wounded him as deeply. Loss had quietly rearranged his priorities. He still believed in courage, reform, and determined action. But he now understood that every public decision ultimately affected real families whose private sorrows would never appear in official records. The years ahead would demand more from him than ever before. Greater responsibilities approached, along with larger conflicts that would test both conviction and wisdom. Yet the man, preparing to face those challenges, was no longer driven only by ambition or discipline. He carried something far more enduring. He carried the quiet understanding that strength without compassion eventually becomes hardness, while compassion without courage accomplishes very little. Somewhere between those two truths, the leader he was destined to become had finally begun to emerge. Returning to public life did not feel like stepping back onto familiar ground. Everything appeared unchanged on the surface. The same buildings stood where they always had. The same streets filled each morning with hurried footsteps and rattling carriages. The same voices debated the same questions in crowded meeting halls. Yet he understood that the person walking through those streets was no longer the man who had left them. Grief had a quiet way of altering every landscape. Places remained the same while the heart learned to see them differently. Those who greeted him expected to find the energetic reformer they had always known. They certainly found his determination intact, but beneath it rested a deeper calm. He spoke less quickly than before. He listened longer before answering difficult questions. Even moments of disagreement unfolded with greater patience. Suffering had taught him that every person carried unseen burdens, and that certainty, however satisfying it might feel, was rarely the beginning of wisdom. People noticed the difference, even if they could not fully explain it. His growing reputation soon brought larger responsibilities. Committees invited him to examine problems that others preferred to avoid. Complicated disputes over public resources, business practices, and government accountability increasingly landed on his desk. Many of these investigations promised little public recognition and even less gratitude. Powerful interests rarely welcomed close examination. Uncomfortable questions often created influential enemies. Still, he accepted each assignment with the same habit that had guided him since childhood. First understand the facts, then decide what is right. Only afterward worry about the consequences. The work demanded endless hours. Documents covered his desk until late into the evening. Witness statements contradicted one another. Financial records revealed patterns that ordinary readers might never notice. Where others saw confusion, he searched patiently for connections. Years spent observing birds, collecting specimens, and recording careful notes had unknowingly prepared him for this exact kind of labor. Careful observation was no different whether studying wildlife or human institutions. Every detail mattered, because truth often hid inside the smallest inconsistencies. There were evenings when exhaustion settled heavily across his shoulders. Friends encouraged him to slow down, reminding him that no individual could solve every problem confronting a rapidly changing nation. He appreciated their concern, yet resting never came naturally to him. He had spent too much of his childhood wishing for the strength simply to participate in ordinary life. Now that strength had finally become his companion, he felt an almost sacred obligation to use it completely. Every healthy day still felt borrowed, and borrowed days should never be wasted. Away from official meetings, he continued escaping into the natural world whenever time allowed. Long rides across open countryside restored a balance that crowded cities could not provide. Forests asked nothing about elections. Rivers cared little for political arguments. Standing beneath enormous trees reminded him how brief every human conflict truly was. Nature neither praised success nor condemned failure. It simply endured. That quiet endurance became a source of comfort whenever public life threatened to consume every waking thought. During one such journey, he paused beside a wide river just before sunset. The water moved steadily around ancient stones that had remained unmoved for countless generations. Watching the current flow around every obstacle, he found himself reflecting upon the strange relationship between persistence and force. The river did not defeat the rocks through anger or violence. It prevailed through constancy, day after day, season after season, year after year. It continued moving forward. Perhaps meaningful change within society followed the same principle. Lasting victories belonged less to dramatic moments than to unwavering commitment. That realization quietly reshaped the way he approached leadership. Instead of searching constantly for spectacular achievements, he began placing greater value upon consistent progress. A single honest reform might appear insignificant beside the enormous problems facing the country. Yet honest reforms accumulated just as rivers slowly carved valleys through stone. People often celebrated dramatic revolutions while overlooking the quieter transformations taking place through faithful daily effort. He resolved never to underestimate small victories again. His ability to communicate also matured during these years. Earlier in life, he had often spoken with overwhelming enthusiasm, eager to persuade others through sheer force of conviction. Experience gradually taught him another approach. Stories reached hearts that arguments could not. Rather than overwhelming listeners with facts alone, he learned to describe ordinary families, struggling workers, dedicated teachers, aging veterans, and young children whose futures depended upon decisions made far away in government offices. Policies became personal when viewed through individual lives. Newspapers increasingly quoted his speeches because readers sensed authenticity behind his words. He did not present himself as someone untouched by hardship. Neither did he seek sympathy for losses already endured. Instead, he spoke as a citizen convinced that courage belonged not only on battlefields, but also inside courtrooms, classrooms, workshops, farms, and family homes. Every honest person carrying responsibility, despite fear, deserved recognition. This broader understanding of heroism resonated with people who had never considered themselves extraordinary. Predictably, greater visibility also attracted stronger opposition. Influential businessmen accused him of interfering with prosperity. Seasoned political figures complained that his standards ignored practical realities. Anonymous letters questioned his motives, while editorials suggested that youthful idealism still clouded his judgment. Criticism arrived almost daily. Years earlier, such attacks might have disturbed him deeply. Now they produced a different response. He examined each complaint carefully, accepting whatever truth it contained and quietly discarding the rest. Peace of conscience gradually became more valuable than public approval. One evening, after an especially difficult week, an older friend asked whether constant conflict ever tempted him to compromise simply for the sake of an easier life. The question lingered in thoughtful silence before he answered. He admitted that comfort remained appealing, perhaps even more appealing after everything he had endured personally. Yet, he also understood that comfort demanded a price. Little by little, it asked people to ignore small wrongs, excuse minor dishonesty, postpone necessary action, and eventually accept conditions they had once promised themselves they would resist. The easiest road often required surrendering convictions so gradually that a person scarcely noticed them disappearing. Those words reflected something far deeper than political philosophy. They revealed the private promise he continued making to himself. The frightened child struggling for breath, the determined teenager lifting weights before sunrise, the grieving husband searching for hope beneath endless skies. All those earlier versions of himself seemed united by one simple refusal. They would not surrender to circumstances, whether confronting illness, sorrow, or corruption. The response remained remarkably similar. Move forward. Remain honest. Continue working. Allow tomorrow to discover that effort had not stopped today. As another year drew to a close, he sensed that the nation itself stood at the edge of significant change. Industries expanded with astonishing speed. Cities grew larger almost overnight. Fortunes rose and disappeared with breathtaking unpredictability. Beneath impressive economic progress, however, questions about fairness, responsibility, and the future of democracy became increasingly difficult to ignore. He suspected that America would soon require leaders willing to confront challenges many others preferred to postpone. He did not yet know exactly what role he would play in that unfolding story, but he felt certain that remaining a passive observer was no longer possible. Standing at his office window, one quiet evening, he watched the last light fade beyond the rooftops, while workers slowly made their way home through crowded streets. Each person disappearing into the gathering darkness carried private hopes, disappointments, responsibilities, and dreams invisible to everyone else. In that ordinary scene, he recognized the true purpose of public service. Leadership was never about power for its own sake. It was about protecting the countless unseen lives that would never appear in history books, yet whose quiet perseverance formed the foundation upon which every nation ultimately stood. Without fully realizing it, he had reached the threshold of a far greater chapter, one that would soon demand not only intelligence and determination, but every lesson life had patiently taught him since childhood. The next opportunity arrived, not because he had sought greater recognition, but because responsibility has a quiet habit of finding those who consistently accept difficult work. By now, his reputation had spread beyond the circles where he had first begun his career. People spoke of him as someone who could not easily be persuaded to ignore uncomfortable facts. Supporters admired that quality. Critics considered it exhausting. Yet both sides agreed on one thing: if he accepted a task, he would pursue it with every ounce of energy he possessed. His new responsibilities placed him closer than ever to the complicated relationship between government and rapidly expanding industry. America was changing at a breathtaking pace. Railroads stretched across enormous distances, connecting towns that had once seemed separated by entire worlds. Factories produced unimaginable quantities of goods. New fortunes appeared almost overnight, transforming unknown businessmen into some of the wealthiest individuals the country had ever seen. Progress inspired admiration, but it also carried consequences that many preferred not to discuss. Behind impressive economic growth stood thousands of ordinary workers whose names never reached newspaper headlines. Long hours, dangerous conditions, uncertain wages, and little protection from injury formed the reality of everyday life for countless families. Children contributed to household income before they were old enough to understand the meaning of exhaustion. Mothers stretched limited resources with extraordinary creativity. Fathers returned home, carrying both physical fatigue and quiet anxiety about whether tomorrow's work would still exist. Prosperity looked very different depending upon where one happened to stand. These realities affected him deeply. He had grown up surrounded by privilege, yet childhood illness had already taught him that comfort never guaranteed security. Now, public service added another lesson. Wealth itself was not the enemy. Dishonesty, exploitation, and indifference were. He believed that success earned through innovation deserved admiration, but success maintained through corruption eventually weakened the entire nation. This distinction became increasingly important as powerful interests attempted to shape public policy according to private advantage. His investigations demanded frequent travel. Trains carried him across expanding cities, through quiet farming communities, and into industrial districts where towering smokestacks darkened the afternoon sky. Each destination revealed another piece of the country's complicated character. In one town, he encountered entrepreneurs whose determination created opportunity for hundreds of families. In another, he found neighborhoods where prosperity seemed to stop abruptly at the gates of large factories. Every journey strengthened his conviction that leadership required seeing the whole picture rather than protecting only one side of the story. He developed a habit that surprised many companions. Whenever possible, he preferred speaking directly with workers instead of relying entirely upon official reports. He visited workshops, warehouses, rail yards, and construction sites, asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than rehearsed politeness. Some laborers answered cautiously, uncertain whether an educated public official could truly understand their concerns. Others spoke openly once they sensed they were being heard rather than judged. Those conversations rarely produced dramatic headlines, yet they shaped his thinking far more profoundly than formal meetings ever could. He also understood that listening demanded humility. Every community believed its own struggles deserved immediate attention, and often they were right. Farmers worried about transportation costs that threatened entire harvests. Factory owners warned that excessive regulation could destroy investment. Laborers pleaded for safer conditions. Local officials balanced shrinking budgets against growing expectations. There were no perfect solutions waiting quietly inside a forgotten document. Leadership required choosing between competing goods rather than simply separating good from evil. During this period, he increasingly withdrew into nature whenever the demands of public life became overwhelming. One autumn journey carried him far beyond crowded cities into landscapes where endless grasslands stretched toward distant horizons. Mornings arrived, wrapped in cool mist, while evenings painted the sky with colors impossible to describe fully on paper. Riding alone through those vast open spaces reminded him that civilization occupied only a small corner of the natural world. Human arguments, however urgent they seemed, gradually lost their sharp edges beneath an immense sky. Those journeys also awakened something adventurous that had quietly waited inside him since childhood. Every unfamiliar trail invited exploration. Every distant ridge encouraged another climb, simply to discover what lay beyond it. Companions occasionally questioned why he insisted upon taking the more difficult route when easier paths already existed. He usually smiled before answering. Difficult roads often revealed the most beautiful views, although spoken lightly. The remark reflected a philosophy extending far beyond travel. He had learned repeatedly that life's richest rewards rarely appeared where comfort expected to find them. His fascination with wildlife continued as passionately as ever. Whenever he encountered unfamiliar animals or birds, he observed them with the same patient attention that had once filled the shelves of his childhood room with carefully labeled collections. Years of political responsibility had not diminished his sense of wonder. If anything, they had deepened it. The natural world reminded him that curiosity should never become another casualty of adulthood, no matter how busy life became. There should always remain room to marvel at ordinary miracles, unfolding quietly beyond human ambition. Friends often remarked that he seemed happiest outdoors, surrounded by forests, rivers, mountains, or wide-open plains. The constant urgency visible in government offices gradually disappeared from his expression. Conversation became slower. Laughter arrived more easily. Even silence felt comfortable. Those who knew him well recognized that these moments were not escapes from responsibility. They were preparations for returning to it. Nature restored something within him that endless meetings inevitably depleted. Without those periods of renewal, his relentless energy might eventually have consumed itself. Back in the capital, however, events continued gathering momentum. Public frustration toward political corruption grew steadily louder. Newspapers published investigations exposing dishonest agreements between influential officials and wealthy corporations. Citizens increasingly questioned whether government truly served the people or merely protected those already possessing power. Confidence, once easily assumed, now required proof. The country appeared to be approaching a moment when old habits could no longer satisfy rising expectations. He welcomed these challenges with cautious optimism. Reform, he believed, should never be driven by anger alone. Anger might expose injustice, but wisdom was needed to replace broken systems with better ones. Too many people confused destruction with progress. Tearing something down required little imagination. Building something fair, durable, and worthy of public trust demanded patience, discipline, and moral courage. These convictions guided his work, even when they slowed immediate results. There were evenings when he questioned whether meaningful change truly remained possible. Corruption possessed deep roots. Selfishness adapted quickly. Every improvement seemed to uncover another problem waiting beneath it. Yet, whenever discouragement approached, memory quietly intervened. He remembered the frightened child who once believed breathing itself might never become easier. If that impossible struggle could gradually change through persistent effort, perhaps societies could change as well. Hope, he concluded, was not naive optimism. Hope was disciplined. Perseverance practiced long enough to outlast despair. His speeches during these years reflected that growing maturity. Rather than promising simple answers, he invited listeners to accept shared responsibility. Democracy, he reminded audiences, depended not only upon elected officials but also upon ordinary citizens choosing honesty over convenience in their daily lives. Corruption survived because too many people tolerated small compromises until larger betrayals became ordinary. Lasting reform, therefore, began inside individual character, long before it appeared inside legislation. The message resonated because it challenged everyone equally, including the speaker himself. Without fully recognizing it, he had become more than an ambitious young public servant. He was slowly emerging as a national voice, capable of inspiring confidence across remarkably different groups of people. Intellectuals admired his knowledge. Workers appreciated his willingness to listen. Journalists respected his directness, even when they disagreed with his conclusions. Opponents continued criticizing his relentless pace. Yet many privately admitted that his integrity proved difficult to question. Years of quiet preparation, private suffering, disciplined study, and patient observation were finally converging into something larger than personal success. Still, history rarely allows anyone to remain comfortable for long. Beyond the horizon, events were already gathering that would demand not only political courage, but physical courage as well. Distant conflicts, rising international tensions, and unexpected opportunities would soon draw him away from familiar offices toward landscapes far more dangerous than committee rooms or legislative debates. The lessons learned in libraries, gymnasiums, lonely trails, and crowded public meetings had prepared him remarkably well. Yet another examination still waited. The next chapter would ask whether the convictions he expressed so confidently in words could survive when tested by genuine danger, where reputation offered no protection and courage could no longer remain an abstract ideal. The nation stood at the edge of a new century with remarkable confidence. Yet, beneath that confidence lay growing uncertainty. Prosperity had transformed cities, expanded industries, and connected distant communities in ways earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. At the same time, the United States found itself looking beyond its own borders with increasing curiosity. Newspapers filled their pages with stories from distant islands, troubled colonies, and rising international rivalries. Questions that had once belonged only to diplomats gradually entered ordinary conversations. What kind of nation would America become? And what responsibilities accompanied its growing influence? He followed these developments with careful attention. Unlike many public figures who viewed foreign affairs as distant abstractions, he believed that events unfolding across oceans would eventually shape the lives of families at home. History had taught him that no nation remained isolated forever. Commerce crossed borders. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Conflict in one corner of the world often echoed far beyond its place of origin. Understanding these connections became another part of his daily study, adding to the already endless stack of books covering his desk. Despite the increasing demands placed upon him, he never allowed reading to become a passive habit. Every page invited questions. Every historical account encouraged comparison with present events. He admired leaders who balanced courage with restraint, but he remained skeptical of those who confused hesitation with wisdom. Experience had convinced him that difficult decisions rarely arrived wrapped in certainty. Waiting endlessly for perfect conditions often meant surrendering the opportunity to shape events before they shaped everyone else. Action carried risks, but inaction carried risks as well. Around him, public debate grew steadily more passionate. Some argued that the country should avoid involvement beyond its own shores and focus entirely upon domestic challenges. Others believed that a rising nation possessed obligations extending beyond its borders. Conversations became sharper inside newspapers, legislative chambers, and private homes alike. He listened carefully to opposing views, recognizing that sincere people could reach very different conclusions while pursuing the same goal. Disagreement, he believed, did not automatically diminish patriotism. Sometimes it revealed the complexity of loving one's country honestly. While political discussions intensified, he continued searching for moments of solitude whenever possible. One crisp morning, before sunrise had fully brightened the landscape, he rode alone across open fields, still covered by a thin layer of mist. The world appeared almost suspended between darkness and daylight. Birds greeted the approaching morning with songs that seemed unchanged by human ambition or political disagreement. Sitting quietly in the saddle, he felt once again the strange peace that nature had offered him throughout every chapter of his life. Whenever society became noisy, the natural world reminded him that clarity often emerged only after silence. Those quiet hours strengthened another conviction that had gradually matured over the years. Courage was not the absence of fear. He had known fear too intimately to believe such comforting myths. Courage meant choosing movement, while fear remained present. The frightened child gasping for breath had not been fearless. The grieving husband wandering lonely landscapes had not been fearless. The young reformer confronting corruption had certainly not been fearless. Each version of himself had simply refused to allow fear the final decision. That distinction mattered deeply because it placed bravery within reach of ordinary people rather than extraordinary heroes alone. Soon, circumstances began moving more rapidly than anyone anticipated. International tensions escalated. Dramatic headlines appeared almost daily, describing violence, diplomatic failures, and growing public anger. Conversations inside government offices shifted from theoretical discussion toward practical preparation. Uncertainty spread across the nation. No one could predict exactly how events would unfold, but many sensed that a turning point approached. Moments like these often reveal hidden aspects of human character. Some people become paralyzed by uncertainty. Others discover strengths they never knew existed. He found himself increasingly drawn toward service that demanded more than speeches or legislative debate. Throughout his life, he had admired individuals willing to accept personal risk for principles they considered larger than themselves. Now, those ideals no longer belonged only to history books. They stood before his own generation, asking uncomfortable questions. What did duty require when circumstances became dangerous? How much should a person be willing to sacrifice for convictions publicly defended but privately untested? These questions refused to remain abstract. They demanded personal answers. Friends attempted to persuade him that his talents belonged in government rather than in dangerous fields where violence could erase years of careful preparation in a single afternoon. They reminded him that he possessed influence, experience, and opportunities unavailable to most people. Surely, they argued, he could contribute more through leadership than through physical risk. He respected their reasoning because it came from genuine concern. Nevertheless, another voice continued speaking quietly inside him. Principles carried greatest weight when lived, rather than merely explained. His decisions surprised many observers, though perhaps it should not have. Anyone who truly understood his life recognized a consistent pattern reaching all the way back to childhood. Whenever comfort and challenge stood before him together, he almost instinctively walked toward challenge, not because hardship itself attracted him, but because difficult roads often revealed truths impossible to discover elsewhere. He had spent years encouraging others to accept responsibility despite uncertainty. Now circumstances required him to follow his own advice. Preparation, once again, became part of everyday life. Long rides strengthened endurance. Physical training intensified despite advancing responsibilities. Maps covered tables beside official documents. Conversations with experienced military officers replaced many ordinary political meetings. Every task reminded him that leadership required practical competence as much as inspiring language. Romantic ideas about conflict quickly disappeared beneath the weight of careful planning. Genuine responsibility always demanded more preparation than imagination initially expected. During these weeks, he often reflected upon his father's influence. Many years had passed since those unforgettable conversations urging a frail boy to build his body, yet their meaning continued expanding with time. Perhaps his father had been speaking about more than muscles and endurance. Perhaps building oneself remained a lifelong responsibility. Character, like physical strength, required constant attention. Neglect gradually weakened what discipline had patiently created. Remembering those lessons filled him with quiet gratitude, even amid growing uncertainty. As departure drew nearer, he spent more time with family and close friends. Ordinary conversations suddenly carried unexpected significance because no one could confidently predict when they might gather again. Shared meals lingered longer than usual. Laughter seemed both warmer and more fragile. Farewells possess a peculiar quality, even before they are spoken. People instinctively notice small details they might otherwise overlook. Preserving ordinary moments, because the future has quietly become uncertain, he carried those memories with him, understanding that affection often reveals its greatest depth when separation approaches. Before leaving, he paused one final evening outside the busy city, watching twilight settle across the landscape. Distant lights slowly appeared one by one, while the sky faded from gold into deep blue. Standing alone, he recognized how strangely intertwined his life had become with the lessons of earlier years. Illness had taught endurance, discipline had taught perseverance, grief had taught compassion, public service had taught responsibility. Now, each lesson seemed to gather into a single purpose. Whatever awaited beyond the horizon, he would meet it not as the frightened child he had once been, but as someone shaped by every challenge life had already placed before him. The journey ahead promised uncertainty, hardship, and consequences impossible to foresee. Yet beneath all those unknowns rested an unexpected calm. He no longer believed that destiny belonged only to extraordinary individuals, blessed with unusual gifts. Destiny belonged equally to ordinary people who answered difficult moments with honesty, persistence, and courage, even while doubting themselves. As the first light of a new morning quietly spread across the horizon, he stepped forward once more, carrying little certainty about the future, but complete certainty about the values he intended to protect. Sometimes that is the only kind of certainty history truly requires. The challenges that awaited him proved very different from the ones imagined in newspapers and political speeches. From a distance, conflict often appeared orderly, almost heroic, shaped into simple stories of courage and victory. Reality carried a different rhythm. It was built from long days of uncertainty, sudden moments of danger, endless waiting, and difficult decisions made with incomplete information. He quickly realized that leadership in uncertain circumstances depended far less upon dramatic words than upon quiet example. People watched what a leader did long before they remembered what he said. Those around him noticed that he rarely asked others to accept hardships he was unwilling to endure himself. When conditions became difficult, he chose to share them. If the day required exhausting travel, he rode beside everyone else. If the weather turned harsh, he remained outdoors rather than seeking unnecessary comfort. These actions were never performed for attention. In truth, many passed unnoticed beyond the small circle witnessing them. Yet trust grows through countless unnoticed moments. People gradually concluded that they were following someone who expected no special privileges simply because of position or reputation. His lifelong fascination with preparation proved invaluable. Years spent studying history had convinced him that unexpected situations rarely favored the strongest individuals. They favored those who adapted most quickly. Plans remained important, but flexibility often determined success. Whenever circumstances changed, he encouraged those around him to remain calm before reacting. Panic consumed energy that careful observation could transform into better decisions. This habit had first appeared during childhood illnesses, when every difficult breath demanded patience rather than desperation. Now, the same discipline guided him under entirely different conditions. Between demanding days, he often found himself reflecting upon the remarkable unpredictability of life. Only a few years earlier, he had imagined a future devoted almost entirely to public service through legislation and reform. Now, experience had broadened his understanding of service itself. Leadership could not remain confined to offices or formal titles. It revealed itself wherever responsibility met uncertainty. Whether comforting an exhausted companion, making an unpopular decision, or accepting personal risk, the essential qualities remained remarkably similar. Character changed very little, even as circumstances transformed completely. There were moments when fear quietly visited everyone. No amount of confidence eliminated uncertainty. Anyone claiming otherwise understood neither human nature nor genuine courage. He recognized that admitting fear did not weaken resolve. Pretending fear did not exist often led to careless decisions. Instead, he encouraged honest preparation, mutual trust, and disciplined action. People gradually discovered that confidence built upon truth lasted far longer than confidence built upon illusion. This atmosphere allowed others to perform beyond what they themselves had considered possible. As weeks passed, observers began describing him in increasingly admiring language. Newspaper correspondents highlighted his energy, determination, and visible presence during difficult moments. Readers back home encountered stories portraying him almost as a larger-than-life figure. He appreciated none of these descriptions as much as strangers imagined. He understood how easily public narratives simplified complicated realities. Every success rested upon countless ordinary people whose names never appeared in print. Every achievement belonged to groups rather than individuals. Fame often illuminated one face while leaving many others in complete darkness. This awareness shaped the way he later remembered those experiences. Whenever asked about memorable events, he frequently spoke first about the courage displayed by ordinary companions rather than his own actions. He recalled acts of quiet generosity shared between exhausted travelers. He described individuals who continued helping others despite personal hardship. He admired resilience, expressed without expectation of recognition. Over time, he became convinced that history often overlooked its finest examples of character, simply because they unfolded without witnesses carrying notebooks or cameras. Eventually, the period of uncertainty gave way to reflection. Returning home, he encountered a nation eager to celebrate visible symbols of courage. Crowds gathered. Journalists asked endless questions. Political allies welcomed him enthusiastically. Public admiration arrived with surprising intensity, opening doors that previously seemed distant. Many people viewed these events as the beginning of his greatest successes. Privately, however, he interpreted them differently. Recognition itself mattered very little unless it created opportunities to serve more effectively. Popularity possessed value only when directed toward meaningful purpose. New responsibilities soon followed. Each demanded broader vision than the one before it. No longer could he focus only upon local concerns or isolated reforms. The decisions now placed before him affected entire regions, countless communities, and future generations who would never know the names of those making choices on their behalf. The scale changed dramatically, yet the principles guiding him remained remarkably familiar. Seek truth carefully. Listen honestly. Decide courageously. Accept responsibility completely. These simple habits had carried him from childhood weakness to public leadership. He saw no reason to abandon them now. At times, the growing expectations felt almost overwhelming. People projected extraordinary hopes onto public figures, imagining that one determined individual could somehow solve every national problem. Experience had already taught him otherwise. Societies improved through the combined efforts of millions, rather than the brilliance of any single leader. His role was not to rescue the nation alone. It was to encourage citizens to believe once again in their own capacity for responsibility. Leadership, at its best, awakened strength already present within others, instead of replacing it. He also recognized another danger accompanying public admiration. Praise, repeated often enough, could quietly separate a person from ordinary reality. Countless leaders throughout history had begun with admirable intentions, only to lose themselves inside carefully constructed images of greatness. Determined never to fall into that trap, he continued seeking experiences that reminded him of life's essential simplicity. Long walks remained part of his routine whenever possible. Conversations with workers, farmers, teachers, and families remained as valuable to him as meetings with influential officials. Nature still restored perspective whenever public life threatened to become overwhelming. During one peaceful afternoon, spent walking through woodland trails, he paused to watch sunlight filtering gently through tall trees. Nothing extraordinary happened. No historic decision demanded immediate attention. No crowd waited nearby. Birds moved quietly between branches, while a cool breeze stirred fallen leaves across the forest floor. Standing there alone, he realized how much of his happiness had always depended upon moments exactly like this. Achievement satisfied ambition for a time, but stillness nourished the soul. Without protecting that inner balance, even the greatest success eventually became another form of exhaustion. He carried this understanding back into public life. Colleagues occasionally wondered how he maintained such relentless energy year after year. The answer was simpler than many expected. He never allowed public responsibility to become his only identity. Somewhere, beneath every official title remained the curious boy who loved wildlife, the determined teenager lifting weights before sunrise, the grieving husband who had sought healing beneath open skies, and the lifelong student who believed every day still offered something worth learning. Preserving those earlier versions of himself protected him from becoming imprisoned by reputation. The years ahead promised achievements that would eventually secure his place among the most influential figures of his generation. They would also bring fierce opposition, painful criticism, personal sacrifices, and decisions whose consequences would echo far beyond his own lifetime. History rarely grants lasting influence without demanding an equally lasting price. Yet if anyone had asked whether he wished to return to the simpler life he had once imagined, he almost certainly would have smiled before quietly declining. Every hardship had shaped him into someone capable of serving in ways the frightened child of long ago could never have imagined. As another chapter slowly opened before him, one truth remained unchanged. Greatness was never created in a single dramatic moment. It emerged through thousands of ordinary choices, repeated faithfully across an entire lifetime. Every difficult morning, every honest conversation, every act of discipline, every season of grief, every opportunity accepted, despite uncertainty, had become part of the same invisible foundation. The world often celebrated the visible achievements standing above the surface, but only those who looked carefully understood that the true story had always been written much deeper, where character patiently grows long before history finally notices its existence. With every passing year, the distance between the young man he had once been and the leader he had become grew larger. Yet he never believed that growth meant leaving his past behind. On the contrary, he carried every earlier version of himself wherever he went. The frightened child struggling for breath, the curious student filling notebooks with observations, the grieving husband searching for meaning beneath endless skies, and the determined reformer refusing to surrender his principles, all continued living quietly within him. Together, they formed the unseen foundation beneath every public decision he would ever make. Leadership gradually revealed itself to be less about commanding others and more about accepting responsibility for consequences that could never be completely predicted. Every decision pleased some people while disappointing others. Every reform solved one problem only to uncover another waiting beneath the surface. There were evenings when he reread reports long after everyone else had gone home, wondering whether another path might have produced a better outcome. Certainty became rarer with experience. Responsibility became heavier. Yet he accepted that burden because he understood that avoiding difficult choices was itself a decision with consequences. His growing influence reached far beyond political circles. Young people wrote letters describing how his determination encouraged them to persevere through illness, poverty, failure, or disappointment. Veterans thanked him for speaking honestly about duty rather than glorifying sacrifice. Teachers admired his lifelong respect for learning, while naturalists appreciated his passionate defense of landscapes many others viewed only as resources waiting to be exploited. These messages reminded him that public service extended beyond laws and institutions. Example often traveled farther than authority ever could. Throughout his life, the natural world remained one of his greatest teachers. Whenever official responsibilities allowed, he escaped into forests, mountains, rivers, and open country. There, he found lessons unavailable inside crowded government buildings. A towering tree never hurried its own growth. A river reached the sea through persistence rather than impatience. Seasons changed without seeking permission from human ambition. Observing these rhythms strengthened his conviction that meaningful achievements required both vision and patience. People often demanded immediate results, but nature quietly demonstrated that lasting transformation unfolded according to deeper laws. This growing appreciation eventually shaped another important part of his legacy. He became increasingly concerned that places of extraordinary beauty might disappear forever beneath uncontrolled expansion. Magnificent forests could be reduced to empty land. Rivers that had flowed freely for centuries could become polluted beyond recognition. Remarkable wildlife might vanish before future generations ever had the opportunity to witness it. Preserving nature was not, in his eyes, an act of sentimentality. It was an act of gratitude toward those who would inherit the country long after his own lifetime had ended. Not everyone agreed with these priorities. Powerful interests argued that economic progress demanded unrestricted development. They viewed untouched wilderness as unused wealth waiting to be claimed. Criticism grew louder whenever preservation limited immediate profit. Once again, he found himself standing between competing visions of the future. One valued short-term gain above all else. The other believed that true prosperity required protecting treasures that money alone could never replace. He accepted the controversy calmly. History had taught him that worthwhile decisions often appeared unpopular before they became widely respected. His willingness to confront criticism remained rooted in habits established decades earlier. Whenever opposition intensified, he returned to careful study rather than emotional reaction. He examined evidence, consulted knowledgeable people, questioned his own assumptions, and only then reached conclusions. This discipline did not guarantee universal agreement, but it protected him from becoming controlled by anger or pride. He believed that conviction without humility easily became stubbornness, while humility without conviction achieved very little. Leadership demanded holding both qualities together, even when doing so felt uncomfortable. The passage of time also softened certain ambitions that had once seemed enormously important. Early recognition, personal achievement, and public praise gradually lost much of their fascination. He had lived long enough to watch celebrated names fade from headlines almost as quickly as they had appeared. Applause echoed loudly for a moment before disappearing into silence. What remained, year after year, were quieter things: the trust of loyal friends, the affection of family, the satisfaction of honest work completed as faithfully as possible. These proved far more durable than reputation. He occasionally wondered how history might eventually remember him. Then, almost immediately, he dismissed the thought. History possessed its own unpredictable habits. Some extraordinary individuals disappeared into obscurity, while others became symbols far larger than their actual lives. Attempting to control that process seemed both impossible and unnecessary. Far better, he concluded, to concentrate on today's responsibilities than tomorrow's reputation. Future generations would tell whatever story they believed the evidence deserved. His task was simply to leave behind evidence worthy of careful consideration. Those closest to him observed that he remained remarkably curious, despite advancing age. New books still filled his shelves. Unfamiliar ideas still attracted his attention. Conversations with younger people energized rather than threatened him. He asked questions with the same enthusiasm that had once inspired a lonely child to collect feathers, insects, and stones inside a crowded family home. Perhaps genuine curiosity represented the one part of his personality that had never fundamentally changed. It continued reminding him that no amount of experience could replace the willingness to learn. There were quiet evenings when he sat alone, reflecting upon the astonishing unpredictability of the path behind him. No carefully designed plan could have anticipated every sorrow, every triumph, every unexpected friendship, every difficult decision, or every remarkable opportunity that had shaped his life. Looking backward, patterns appeared almost obvious. Living through them had felt entirely different. The future had always been hidden behind uncertainty, revealed only one ordinary day at a time. Perhaps that was life's greatest mercy. Had anyone seen the entire journey from the beginning, they might never have found the courage to take the first step. As the years continued passing, younger generations increasingly viewed him as a figure belonging to history rather than to everyday life. This amused him quietly, because he still felt very much like the same restless student searching for answers. Age had provided experience, but it had not eliminated wonder. He remained convinced that every sunrise carried another invitation to become slightly wiser, slightly kinder, and slightly more useful than the day before. Perfection had never been the goal. Faithful effort had always been enough. The closing chapters of any remarkable life rarely arrive with dramatic music or clear announcements. Instead, they unfold through ordinary mornings, familiar conversations, recurring routines, and gradual changes almost too subtle to notice. Strength yields slowly to age. Busy schedules become quieter. Journeys grow shorter. Memories occupy more space than plans. He accepted these changes with surprising peace because he understood that no season was meant to last forever. Just as childhood had prepared him for adulthood, and hardship had prepared him for leadership, age now prepared him for reflection. Looking back across the decades, one truth appeared again and again. The greatest victories of his life had never been political. They had never depended entirely upon titles, elections, or public recognition. His greatest victories occurred each time fear failed to determine his choices. They appeared when illness refused to define his future, when grief failed to destroy his compassion, when criticism failed to silence conviction, and when success failed to replace humility. These quiet triumphs remained invisible to most observers, yet they formed the true measure of the man he had become. The final chapter of his journey was approaching, and with it would come one last opportunity to reveal what kind of legacy survives after every title, every achievement, and every public celebration has gently faded into history. Time, which had once seemed to move with relentless speed, now unfolded more gently. The urgent rhythm that had carried him through countless campaigns, investigations, journeys, and public responsibilities gradually gave way to quieter mornings and longer evenings. He remained intellectually restless, still reading, still writing, still exploring new ideas whenever the opportunity appeared. Yet age possesses a quiet wisdom of its own. It teaches even the most determined souls that there is a difference between accomplishing more and understanding more deeply. He never lost his fascination with the natural world. Whenever responsibilities allowed, he escaped into forests, mountains, rivers, and wide-open landscapes where human ambition seemed wonderfully small beneath an endless sky. Among ancient trees and flowing water, he felt the same peace that had comforted him since childhood. Nature had witnessed civilizations rise and disappear. It had watched generations arrive full of confidence before quietly returning to silence. Standing within that timeless world reminded him that every human life, regardless of achievement, remained only one brief chapter in a story much larger than itself. Friends sometimes asked whether he regretted the extraordinary pace at which he had lived. The question always carried an understandable curiosity. After all, few people embraced as many challenges, accepted as many responsibilities, or pushed themselves with such relentless determination. He considered the question carefully whenever it arose. There were certainly moments he wished he could relive, conversations he wished had lasted longer, and loved ones he wished he could embrace one more time. Yet regret itself held little attraction for him. Every joyful memory had been purchased alongside hardship, and every hardship had quietly prepared him for the next chapter waiting beyond it. His body, however, no longer obeyed him with the same eager confidence it once had. Years of demanding travel, physical exertion, emotional strain, and countless adventures had left their mark. Old injuries reminded him of forgotten battles. Long journeys required greater effort than before. Recovery came more slowly. There were mornings when simply rising demanded patience that younger versions of himself would never have understood. Still, he accepted these changes without bitterness. He had spent a lifetime believing that the body should be used fully rather than preserved carefully. Now it simply carried the honest evidence of that belief. Even as physical strength slowly declined, his curiosity remained astonishingly alive. Visitors often found books stacked across tables, notes filling margins, and conversations wandering effortlessly from history to science, from literature to conservation, from philosophy to the future of democracy. He remained convinced that learning should continue until the final day of life. Ignorance, not age, represented the true enemy of growth. Every unanswered question still awakened the same quiet excitement that had once inspired a lonely child to fill shelves with collections from the natural world. Those who spent time with him during these later years noticed another quality that experience had refined. He had become more generous with uncertainty. In earlier decades, he often defended ideas with fiery confidence. Now, he recognized that honest people frequently reached different conclusions while seeking the same worthy goal. Certainty had softened into wisdom without becoming weakness. Conviction remained, but it now walked beside humility rather than pride. This quiet balance perhaps represented one of the most remarkable transformations of his entire life. Looking back across the decades, he saw that many moments once appearing disastrous had ultimately redirected him toward unexpected growth. Illness had introduced discipline. Grief had awakened compassion. Criticism had strengthened integrity. Failure had cultivated resilience. Success itself had taught caution. Each season, whether welcomed or resisted, had quietly contributed something essential. No experience stood entirely alone. Every chapter prepared the next, even when the connection remained invisible until years later. There were evenings when he sat alone watching the fading light settle across familiar landscapes, allowing memory to wander wherever it wished. Faces long absent returned with astonishing clarity. Childhood laughter echoed faintly through old rooms, and distant journeys unfolded once more beneath open skies. Conversations with his father seemed almost close enough to hear. He realized that memory possesses its own geography. Places disappear, buildings change, generations pass away. Yet, certain moments remain untouched, preserved with remarkable tenderness inside the human heart. Among all those memories, one lesson appeared more often than any other. Strength had never meant becoming invincible. True strength meant continuing, despite vulnerability. He had spent much of his youth believing that courage required defeating fear. Age taught him something gentler. Fear, sorrow, uncertainty, and hope often travel together. Bravery does not demand eliminating one in order to welcome the others. It simply asks that love, purpose, and responsibility continue leading the way, even while fear quietly walks beside them. As the final season of his life approached, the pace of public appearances naturally slowed. Younger leaders now occupied positions once held by his generation. Fresh voices debated new challenges. The country continued changing exactly as it always had. Some observers viewed this transition with sadness. He viewed it differently. Every generation receives only temporary stewardship of history. No one is meant to hold the future forever. The greatest contribution older generations can make is preparing those who follow to carry responsibilities even further. On one peaceful evening, after spending hours reading and reflecting, he looked through a nearby window toward the fading horizon. The sky glowed softly beneath the last colors of sunset, while distant trees stood quietly against the gathering darkness. Nothing extraordinary interrupted the moment. No important visitor arrived. No urgent message demanded immediate attention. Only silence remained. Strangely, that silence felt familiar rather than empty. Throughout his life, he had searched for meaning in movement, yet now he discovered equal meaning in stillness. Not long afterward, his remarkable journey gently approached its conclusion. There was no grand farewell worthy of history books, no dramatic speech designed to summarize an extraordinary life. Instead, there was something far more human. Loved ones remained nearby. Familiar surroundings offered comfort. The relentless energy that had once carried him across mountains, forests, cities, and public offices slowly gave way to peaceful rest. The heart that had refused surrender through countless trials finally accepted the one destination every life must eventually reach. When news of his passing spread, countless people remembered different versions of the same man. Some remembered the reformer who challenged powerful interests. Others remembered the passionate defender of nature. Many admired the courageous public servant. Historians celebrated the leader whose influence reached far beyond his own generation. Friends remembered laughter, conversation, curiosity, and loyalty. Family remembered something quieter still: the ordinary moments hidden behind every extraordinary achievement. Each memory revealed only part of a much larger life. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy he left behind could never be measured through monuments, official titles, or pages written in history books. It lived inside an idea made believable by the example of his own journey. A fragile beginning does not determine a permanent future. Weakness can become discipline. Disappointment can become compassion. Fear can become courage through repeated acts of quiet perseverance. No miracle transformed his life overnight. No single victory defined him forever. Instead, thousands of ordinary choices, repeated faithfully across decades, slowly shaped an extraordinary character. That truth remains as meaningful today as it was during his lifetime. Every generation encounters uncertainty that feels unique. Every person faces private battles invisible to the wider world. Some struggle with illness. Others carry grief, loneliness, failure, anxiety, or disappointment. Circumstances differ, yet the invitation remains remarkably similar. Continue taking the next honest step. Continue learning. Continue serving. Continue choosing integrity, even when no audience is watching. History often remembers famous names, but character is built long before history notices. Perhaps that is why his story continues speaking across generations. Not because he never failed, not because he never doubted, not because life treated him gently. His story endures because it reminds us that greatness rarely begins with extraordinary talent. More often, it begins quietly, inside an ordinary person deciding, once again, not to surrender. And if someone had walked past that silent bedroom on the final morning of his life, they might have seen only an elderly man resting after many difficult years. History, however, saw something more. It saw the completion of a journey that had begun with a frightened child searching desperately for one more breath. Between those two moments stretched an entire lifetime of discipline, curiosity, courage, love, grief, service, and hope. The breath that had once been so difficult to find had become a life fully lived, and perhaps, in the end, there can be no greater triumph than that.